Chapter 4: The Danish Invasions and the Great Kings of Wessex, by Charles Oman. The English chronicles have accurately fixed for us the date of the first raid of the Northmen. In 787, 3 strange ships were seen off the Dorsetshire coast. From them landed a small band of marauders who sacked the port of Wareham and then hastily put to sea and vanished from sight. This insignificant descent was only the first of a series of dreadful ravages. A few years later, in 793, a greater band descended on Lindisfarne, the holy island of St. Cuthbert off the Bernician coast, the greatest and richest monastery of northern England. Thenceforth raids came thick and fast, till at last the sword of the invaders had turned half England into a desert. The people of Scandinavia were at this moment in much the same state of development in which the English had been 3 centuries before, ere yet they left the shores of Saxony and Schleswig. The Danes and Norwegians were a hardy seafaring race, divided into many small kingdoms, always at war with each other. They were still wild heathens, and practiced piracy as the noblest occupation for warriors and freemen. Just as Hengist and Aelle had sailed out with their war bands in search of plunder and land in the 5th century, so the chiefs of the Northmen were now preparing to lead out their followers into the western seas. For 2 centuries, the onslaughts of the Vikings, as these piratical hordes were called, were fated to be the curse of Christendom. The Vikings in their early days were led, not by the greater kings of Denmark and Norway, but by leaders chosen by the pirate bands for their military abilities. Such chiefs were obeyed on the battlefield alone. Off it they were PG-34 treated with small respect by their comrades. There were dozens of these sea kings on the water, each competing with the others for the largest following that he could get together. The Northmen were at first seeking for nothing more than plunder. Western Christendom offered them a great field, because the Franks, English, and Irish of the 9th century almost all dwelt in open towns, had very few forts and castles, and had built enormous numbers of rich defenseless monasteries and churches. The Dane landed near a wealthy port or abbey, sacked it, and hastily took to sea again, before the countryside had time to muster in arms against him. But after a time, the continued successes of their first raids encouraged the Northmen to take the field in much greater numbers, so that fleets of 100 ships, with 8 or 10,000 men aboard them, were found sailing under some noted sea king. When they grew so strong, they took to making raids deeper into the land, boldly facing the force of an English shire or a Frankish county if they were brought to bay. When numbers were equal, they generally had the advantage in the fray, for they were all trained warriors and were fighting for their lives. Against them came only a rustic militia fresh from the plough. If beset by the overwhelming strength of a whole kingdom, they fortified themselves on a headland, an island, or a marsh-girt palisade, and held out till the enemy melted homeward for lack of provisions. As long as Ecgbert lived, he kept the Danes away from his kingdom of Wessex, dealing them heavy blows whenever they dared to march inland. The greatest of these victories was one gained at Hengistesdon, Hingston Down, near Plymouth, over the combined forces of the Danes and the revolted Welsh of Cornwall, 835. But though he was able to protect his own realm, Ecgbert was unable to care for his Mercian and Northumbrian vassals. They were too far off, and his authority over them was too weak. So northern England was already suffering fearfully from the Viking raids even before Ecgbert died. His son Ethelwulf, who succeeded him as King of Wessex, was a pious, easygoing man, destitute of his father's strength and ability. If the Mercians and Northumbrians had not been so PG-35, desperately afflicted at the moment by the ravages of the Vikings, they would have undoubtedly taken the opportunity to throw off the yoke of the Wessex kings. But their troubles made them cautious of adding civil war to foreign invasion, and so Ethelwulf was allowed to keep his father's nominal suzerainty over the whole of England. More than once he led a West Saxon army up to aid the Mercians, but he could not be everywhere at the same time, and while he was protecting one point, the Danes would slip round by sea and attack another. Wessex itself was no longer secure from their incursions, and the chronicles record several disastrous raids carried out on its coast. All through King Ethelwulf's reign, 836–858, the state of England was growing progressively worse. Commerce was at a standstill, many of the larger towns had been burnt by the Danes, the greatest of the monasteries had been destroyed, and their monks slain or scattered. With them perished the wealth and the learning which had made the English Church the pride of Western Christendom. The land was beginning to sink back into poverty and barbarism, and there seemed to be no hope left to the English, for the Viking armies grew larger and bolder every year. After a time, the invaders began to aim at something more than transitory raids. They took to staying over the winter in England, instead of returning to Norway or Denmark. Fortifying themselves in strong posts like the Isles of Thanet or Sheppey, they defied King Ethelwulf to dislodge them. In a very short time, it was evident that they would think of permanently occupying Britain, just as the Saxons and Angles had done 3 centuries back. Ethelwulf, in great distress of mind, made a pilgrimage to Rome and obtained the Pope's blessing for his efforts, but he fared none the better for that. It was equally in vain that he tried to concert measures for common defense with his neighbor across the Channel, King Charles the Bald, whose daughter Judith he took to wife. The Frankish king was even more vexed by the pirates than Ethelwulf himself, and no help was got from him. The men of Wessex at last grew so discontented with page 36 Ethelwulf's weak rule that the Witan deposed him, and elected his son Ethelbald king in his stead, 856. But they left the small kingdoms of Kent and Sussex to the old man for the term of his natural life, to maintain him in his royal state. Ethelwulf died 2 years later, and after him reigned his 3 short-lived sons, Ethelbald 856–860, Ethelbert 868–66, and Ethelred 866–871. The 15 years, during which they ruled, proved a time of even greater misery and distress than the latter days of their father's troubled reign. The Danes not only penetrated into every nook and corner of Mercia and Northumbria, but even struck at the heart of Wessex and burnt its capital, the ancient city of Winchester, 864. But the source trial came 2 years later, in the time of King Ethelred. A vast confederacy of many Viking bands, which called itself the Great Army, leagued themselves together and fell on England, no longer to plunder, but to subdue and occupy the whole land. Under 2 chiefs, called Ingwar and Hubba, they overran Northumbria in 867. The Northumbrians were divided by civil war, but the rival kings, Osberht and Aelle, joined their forces to resist the oncoming storm. Yet both of them were slain by the Danes in a great battle outside the gates of York, and the victors stormed and sacked the Northumbrian capital after the engagement. They then proceeded to divide up the land among themselves and settled up all the old kingdom of Dara, from Tees to Trent. The English population was partly slain off, partly reduced to serfdom. So, after being for 200 years a Christian kingdom, Dara became once more a community of wild heathen. The work of Oswald and Aidan seemed undone. But the whole of the Danes of the Great Army could not find land in Dara. One division of them went off against the East Angles under Jarl Ingwar and fought a great battle with Edmund, the brave and pious king of that race. They took him prisoner, and when he would not do them homage or worship their gods, they shot him to death with arrows. His followers secretly buried his body and raised over it a shrine which became the great Abbey of St. Edmundsbury. East Anglia was then divided up among the PG 37 victorious Danes, just as Yorkshire had been, but they did not settle down so thickly in the eastern counties as in the north, and the share of Danish blood in those districts is comparatively small, 869. King Ethelred of Wessex had not been able to afford any practical help to his Northumbrian and East Anglian neighbors. It was now his own turn to face the storm which had overwhelmed the 2 northern realms. In 870, the Great Army, now under 2 kings, Guthrum and Bagsig, sailed up the Thames and threw itself upon Surrey and Berks, the northern border of Wessex. Ethelred came out in haste against them, and with him marched his younger brother Alfred, the youngest of the 4 sons of the old Ethelwulf, a youth of 18, who now entered on his first campaign. The men of Wessex made a far sterner defense than had the armies of the other English kingdoms. The two warrior brothers Ethelred and Alfred fought no less than 6 battles with the great army. In the single year 871, the war raged all along the line of the chalk downs of Berkshire as the Danes strove to force their way westward. At last, the men of Wessex gave them a thorough beating at Ashdown, where the Etheling Alfred won the chief honor of the day. The defeated Vikings sought refuge in a stockaded camp at Reading, between the waters of the Thames and the Kennet. Ethelred could not dislodge them from this stronghold, and in a skirmish with one of their foraging parties at Merton, in Surrey, he received a mortal wound, 871. Wearied with 6 battles, the army of Wessex broke up, and the Thanes sadly bore King Ethelred home to bury him at Wimborne. His young brother, the Etheling Alfred, succeeded him and took up the task of defending Wessex in its hour of sore distress. It was fortunate that such a great man was at hand to bear the burden, for never was it more likely than now that the English name would be utterly swept off the face of the earth. In spite of his youth, Alfred was quite capable of facing any difficulty or danger. From his boyhood upward, he had always shown great promise. When a young child, he had been sent by his father, Ethelwulf, to Rome, and there had attracted the notice of Pope Leo, who PG 38 anointed him and predicted that he should one day be a king. He was able and brave, like most of the descendants of Ecgbert, but he was also far above all men of his day in his desire for wisdom and learning, and from his earliest years was known as a lover of books and scholars. Seldom, if ever, did any king combine so much practical ability in war and governance with such a keen taste for literature and science. Alfred had short space to mourn his dead brother. The great army soon forced its way up from the Thames into Wiltshire and beat the men of Wessex at Wilton. Then Alfred gave them great store of treasure to grant him peace, and they, since they found that the winning of Wessex cost so many hard blows, consented to turn aside for a space. But it was only in order to throw themselves on the neighboring realm of Mercia. They dealt with it as they had already done with Dara and East Anglia. They defeated Burgred, its king, who fled away over sea and died at Rome. And then they took eastern Mercia and parcelled it out among themselves, while they gave its western half to an unwise thane called Ceolwulf, who consented to be their vassal and proffered them a great tribute. It was not long, however, before they chased away him also. Now it was that there arose the great Danish towns in Mercia, Derby, Stamford, Leicester, Lincoln, and Nottingham, which, under the name of the 5 boroughs, played a considerable part in English history for the next 2 centuries, 876. When Mercia had fallen, the Vikings turned once more against their old foes in Wessex. If only they could break down King Alfred's defences, they saw that the whole Isle of Britain would be their own. So under the 2 kings, Guthrum and Hubba, they once more pushed southward beyond the Thames. There followed 2 years of desperate fighting, 877–878. At first, the invaders swept all before them. They took London, the greatest port of England, and Winchester, the capital of Wessex. Alfred, repeatedly beaten in battle, was forced westward and driven to take refuge almost alone in the Isle of Athelney, a marsh-girt spot in Somersetshire between the Tone and the Parrett. This was the scene of the celebrated legend of the burnt cakes. A curious memorial of Alfred's stay in Athelney is to be seen at Oxford, a PG 39 gold and enamel locket bearing his name, which was dug up in the island some 900 years after it was dropped by the wandering king. While Alfred was in hiding, the Danes ranged all over Wessex. King Guthrum settled down at a fortified camp at Chippenham in Wiltshire, while King Hubba ravaged Devon. But when all seemed in their power, they were suddenly disconcerted by a new gathering of the stubborn West Saxons. The men of Devon slew Hubba and took his raven banner, and then Alfred, issuing from Athelney, put himself at the head of the levies of Devon, Somerset, and Dorset, and made a desperate assault on Guthrum and the main body of the Danes. The king was victorious at Ethandun, Eddington, and drove the army of Guthrum into its stockade at Chippenham. There the Vikings were gradually forced by starvation to yield themselves up. Alfred granted them easy terms, if they would promise to quit Wessex forever and would swear homage to him as overlord and become Christians, he would grant them the lands of the East Angles and East Saxons to dwell in. Guthrum was fain to accept, so he was baptized and received at Alfred's hands the new name of Ethelstan. Many of his host followed him to the font, and then they retired to East Anglia and dwelt therein, save those roving spirits who could not settle down anywhere. These latter went off to harry France, but King Guthrum and the majority abode in their new settlement, and were not such unruly or unfaithful subjects to Alfred as might have been expected from their antecedents. In such troublous times, it was not likely that Alfred would be free from other wars, but he came out of them all with splendid success. When new bands of Vikings assailed him in later years, he smote them again and again and drove them out of the land, as a Norse poet once sang. So they betook themselves elsewhere, to strive with less valiant kings beyond the seas. By Alfred's agreement with Guthrum, England was divided into two halves, of which one was Danish and the other English. The old document called Alfred's and Guthrum's Frith gives the boundary of the Danelagh or Danish settlement, thus, up the Lee and then across to Bedford, up the Ouse to Watling Street, and so along Watling Street to Chester. That is to say that Northumbria and East Anglia and Essex and the eastern half of Mercia were left to the Danes, while Alfred reigned directly, not only over his own heritage of Wessex, Sussex, and Kent, but over western Mercia also. The 9 counties west of Watling Street became part of Wessex, so that Alfred's own kingdom came out of the Danish War much increased. Beyond its bounds, he now had a nominal suzerainty over 3 Danish states instead of 4 English ones. Guthrum reigned in the east, another Danish king at York, and between them lay the 5 boroughs, which were independent of both kings and were ruled by their own jarls, as the Danes called their warlords. The Danish rule in northeastern England was made comparatively light to the old inhabitants of the land when Guthrum and his men embraced Christianity. Instead of killing the people off or reducing them to slavery, the Danes now were content to take tribute from them and to occupy a certain portion of their lands. The limit and extent of the Danish settlement can be well traced by studying the names of places in the northern counties. Wherever the invaders established themselves, we find the Danish termination by in greater or less abundance. We find such names strewn thick about Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Nottinghamshire, and Leicestershire, less freely in Derbyshire, Northamptonshire, and the eastern counties. Rugby, close to the line of Watling Street, is the Danish settlement that lies furthest into the heart of Mercia. The Viking blood, therefore, is largely mixed with the English in the valleys of the Trent and Ouse, and close to the eastern coast, and grows proportionately less as Watling Street is approached. The Danes took very easily to English manners. They had all turned Christians within a very few years, and their language was so like Old English that their speech PG-41 soon became assimilated to that of their subjects, and could only be told from that of South England by differences of dialect that gradually grew less. In the end, England gained rather than suffered by their invasion, for they brought much hardy blood into the land and came to be good Englishmen within a very few generations. But meanwhile, when they were but just settled down, and the PG-42 land was still black with their burnings, England appeared in a sorry state, and Alfred the King had a hard task before him when he set to work to reform and reorganize his wasted realm. Well, nigh every town had been sacked and given to the flames at one time or another during 50 years of war. The churches lay in ruins, the monasteries were deserted. Riches and learning had fled from the wasted land. There was not one priest south of Thames, writes King Alfred himself, who could properly understand the Latin of his own church books, and very few in the whole of England. Moreover, the social condition of the people was rapidly becoming what we may style feudalized. That is, the smaller freeholders all over the country, unable to defend themselves from the Danes, were yielding themselves to be the men of their greater neighbors. This phrase implied that they surrendered their complete independence and consented to pay the great men certain dues and to follow them to the wars and seek justice at their hands instead of from the free meeting of the village moot. The land still remained the peasant's own, but instead of being personally free, he was now a dependent. It is noticeable that a similar state of things grew up from the same cause in every part of Western Europe during the 9th century. Finding himself confronted with this new condition of affairs, Alfred strengthened the royal power by compelling all these great lords to become his own sworn followers, Jessiths, as they would have been called in an earlier age. But now the word was thane, though the status was much the same. So all the great landholders of England became the king's men, just as the villagers had become the men of the great landholders. The thanes served the king in bower and hall, and had to follow him in person whenever he took the field, as the old Jessiths had followed the leaders of the first Saxon warbands. They were a numerous body and constituted a kind of standing army, since it was their duty to serve whenever their master went out to battle. The fyrd, or local militia of the villages, Alfred divided into two parts, one of which was always left at home to till the fields when the other half went out to war. It was at the head of his thanes and this reorganized fyrd that Alfred smote the Danes when they dared to invade his realm in his later years. Alfred has a great name as a lawgiver, but he did more in the way of collecting and codifying the laws of the kings who were before him than in issuing new ordinances of his own. But since he made everything clear and orderly, the succeeding generations used to speak of the laws of Alfred, when they meant the ancient statutes and customs of the realm. The most noteworthy, however, of Alfred's doings, if we consider the troublous times in which he lived, were his long-sustained and successful endeavors to restore the civilization of England, at which the Danish wars had dealt such a deadly blow. He collected scholars of note from the continent, from Wales and Ireland, and founded schools to restore the lost learning for which England had been famed in the last century. His interest in literature of all kinds was very keen. He collected the old heroic epics of the English, all of which, save the poem of Beowulf, have now perished or survive only in small fragments. He compiled the celebrated Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and left it behind him as a legacy to be continued by succeeding ages, as indeed it was for nearly 300 years. He also translated Beda's Latin History of England into the vernacular tongue, as well as Orosius' General History of the World. Nor was history the only province in which he took interest. He also caused Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care and other theological works to be done into English. Alfred may also be reckoned the father of the English Navy. In order to cope with the ships of the Vikings, he built new war vessels of larger size than any that had yet been seen in Western Europe, and provided that they should be well manned. He encouraged sailors to go on long voyages and sent out the captain other, who sailed into the Arctic seas and discovered the North Cape. He was a friend of merchants, and it was probably to him that we may attribute the law which allowed any trader who fared thrice oversea in his own ship to take the rank and privileges of a thane. We have no space to tell of the many other spheres of Alfred's activity, such as his church building, his mechanical inventions, and his zeal in almsgiving and missionary work, which was so great that he even sent contributions to the PG-44 distant Christians of St. Thomas in India. What heightens our surprise at the many-sided activity of the man is that he was of a weakly constitution and was often prostrated by the attacks of a periodical illness which clung to him from his youth up. Alfred lived in great peace and prosperity. He had increased the bounds of Wessex, saved England from the Dane, and brought her back to the foremost place among the peoples of Western Europe, for his Frankish contemporaries were sinking lower and lower amid the attacks of the Vikings, while England, under his care, was so rapidly recovering her strength. Even the Welsh, hostile hitherto to all who bore the English name, had done homage to him in 885, because they saw in him their only possible protection against the Dane. Alfred's son and his 3 grandsons followed him on the throne in succession between the years 901, and they were all brave, able, hard-working princes, the worthy offspring of such a progenitor. They carried out to the full the work that he had begun. While Alfred had checked the Danes and made them his vassals, his descendants completely subdued and incorporated them with the main body of the realm, so that they were no longer vassals but direct subjects of the crown. And while Alfred had been overking of England, his successors became overkings of the whole Isle of Britain, the suzerains of the Scots and the Welsh of Strathclyde, as well as of all the more southern peoples within the 4 seas. Alfred's eldest son and successor was Edward, generally called Edward the Elder to distinguish him from two later kings of his line. He was a wise and powerful king, whose life work was the incorporation of central England, south of the Humber, with his realm of Wessex, by the complete conquest of the Danes of East Anglia and the Five Boroughs. When Alfred was dead, his Danish vassals tried to stir up trouble by raising up against Edward his cousin Ethelwulf, son of Ethelred. This pretender the new king drove out, and then, turning on the eastern Danes, slew their king Euric, the son of Guthrum Ethelstan, and made them swear homage to him again. But a few years later, the Danes broke out again into rebellion. PG 45 and Edward then took in hand their complete subjection. His chief helper was the great Ealdorman Ethelred of Western or English Mercia, his brother-in-law. When this chief died, Edward found his widowed sister Ethelfled, in whose hands he left the rule of the Mercian counties, no less zealous and able an assistant than her husband had been. It was with her cooperation that he started on his long series of campaigns against the Danes of central and eastern England. While Edward, starting forward from London, worked his way into Essex and East Anglia, Ethelfled was at the same time urging on the Mercians against the Danes of the Five Boroughs. They moved forward systematically, erecting successive lines of burghs, or moated and palisaded strongholds, opposite the centers of Danish resistance, and holding them with permanent garrisons. The Danes were now much more easy to deal with than in the old days, for they had given hostages to fortune, and were the possessors of towns and villages which could be plundered, farmsteads that could be burned, and cattle that could be lifted. So when they found that they could not storm the burghs of Edward and Ethelfled, or drive off the garrisons which raided on their fields, they began one after the other to submit. The last Danish king of East Anglia was slain in battle at Tempsford, near Bedford, in 921, and his realm was incorporated with Wessex. Then, while Ethelfled compelled Derby and Leicester to yield, her brother subdued Stamford and Lincoln. So all England south of the Humber was won and cut up into new shires, like those of Wessex. Having accomplished her share in this great work, the Lady Ethelfled died, and the great ealdormanry which she had ruled was absorbed into her brother's kingdom. In their terror at Edward's ceaseless advance and never-ending successes, not only did the Danes of Northumbria do him homage, but even the distant kings of the Scots and the Strathclyde Welsh took him to father and lord in a great meeting held at Dore in 924. Having thus become the overlord of all Britain, Edward died in 925, leaving the throne to his son Ethelstan. This prince was his worthy successor, and carried out still further PG 46, the process of annexing all England to the Wessex inheritance. His great achievement was the complete subjection and annexation of Northumbria. When Sitric, the Danish king of York, died, Ethelstan seized on his kingdom and drove his sons over sea. The dispossessed princes stirred up enemies against their conqueror and formed a great league against him. Anlaf, the king of the Danes of Ireland, brought over a great host of Vikings, while Constantine, king of the Scots, and Owen, king of Cumbria, came down from the north to join him. The Danes of Yorkshire at once rose in rebellion to aid the invaders. Against this league, Ethelstan marched forth at the head of the English of Mercia and Wessex. He met them at Brunanburg, a spot of unknown site, somewhere in Lancashire. There Ethelstan smote them with a great slaughter, so that Anlaf returned to Ireland with but a handful of men, and Constantine, who lost his son and heir in the fight, fled away hastily to his own northern deserts. The fight of Brunanburg, the greatest battle that the House of Alfred had yet won, finally settled the fact that Danish England was to be incorporated with the realm of the Wessex overkings, and that there was to be one nation, not two, from the borders of Scotland to the British Channel. This great victory drew from an unknown poet the famous Song of Brunanburg, which has been inserted in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. It tells of the glories of Ethelstan and how the fight made Ethelstan once more lord of all Britain. The Scot king hastened to renew his submission, the Welsh and Cornish did him homage, the turbulent Northumbrian Danes bowed before him. He was considered so much the most powerful monarch in Western Europe that all the neighboring kings sought his alliance and asked for the hands of ladies of his house. Of his sisters, one was married to the Emperor Otto I, one to Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, others to the king of Arles and the counts of Paris and Flanders. Ethelstan died young and left no son. He was followed on the throne by his two brothers Edmund and Edred, who were equally unfortunate in being cut off in the flower of their age. Edmund suppressed more than one rebellion of the Northumbrian Danes and completely conquered the Welsh kingdom of Strathclyde. Instead of incorporating it with England, he bestowed it as a fief on his vassal, Malcolm, King of the Scots, on condition that he should be his faithful fellow worker by sea and land. This was the first extension of Scotland to the south of the Clyde and Forth. Up to this time, the Scots and the Picts, with whom they had become blended since the Scot Kenneth MacAlpine had been elected King of the Picts in 836, had only ruled in the Highlands. Edmund came to a strange and bloody end. As he feasted in his hall at Pucklechurch in Gloucestershire, he saw to his anger and surprise a notorious outlaw named Leoffer enter the hall and seat himself at a table. The servants tried to turn him out, but he held his place, and Edmund grew so wrathful that he sprang from his high seat and rushed down to drag the intruder out with his own hands. He seized Leoffer by the hair and threw him down, but the outlaw drew a knife and stabbed him to the heart. Edred, the next king, was a prince of weak health, fonder of the church than the battlefield. Nevertheless, he carried on his brother's policy and kept a firm hand over the whole island of Britain. He put down the last rising of the Danes of Yorkshire, who had proclaimed Eric with the Bloody Axe as their king, and made one last attempt to assert their independence. After this, he cut up Northumbria into two earldoms and gave them both to an Englishman named Oswulf to be ruled as separate provinces. Edred was the patron and protector of the wise Abbot Dunstan, the first of the great clerical statesmen who made a mark on the history of England. He was a man of great ability and learning, who had risen to be Abbot of Glastonbury under Edmund, and became one of the chief advisers of the pious Edred, who was attracted to him as much by his asceticism as by his eminent mental qualities. Dunstan was a man with a purpose. He wished to reform the English church in the direction of monastic asceticism, and PG 48 was most especially anxious to make compulsory the celibacy of the clergy, a practice which had not hitherto been enforced in England. There was undoubtedly much ignorance and a certain amount of ill-living among the secular clergy, and Dunstan, not content with warring against this, tried also to reform the monasteries all over the face of the land, and to enforce the rule of St. Benedict, poverty, chastity, and obedience in every place. Dunstan's method of carrying out his views was by winning court influence, which he was very fitted to obtain, for he was the cleverest, most versatile, and most learned man of his day. When the pious Edred died, he was succeeded by his nephew Edwig, the son of his brother Edmund. This prince had been a child when Leoffer the outlaw slew his father, and the Witan had put him aside in favor of his uncle, because the rule of a minor was always disliked by the English. But now he was 17, and a very rash and headstrong youth. Edwig very soon quarrelled with Dunstan and with Oda, Archbishop of Canterbury, because he insisted on taking to wife the lady Elgiva, who was his near kinswoman and within the prohibited degrees of the medieval church. The churchmen declared her to be no true wife of the king, and treated the royal pair with such insult that Edwig grew furious. The tale is well known how, when Edwig at a high feast had retired betimes to his wife's chamber, Oda and another bishop followed him and dragged him back by force to the board where the thanes were feasting. The king, as was natural, quarrelled with the church party and drove Dunstan out of England. But his clerical opponents were too much for him. They conspired with the Anglo-Danes of Northumbria and with many discontented thanes, and set up against Edwig his younger brother Edgar, whom Archbishop Oda crowned as King of England. There followed civil war, in which Edwig had the worst. His wife fell into the hands of Oda, who cruelly branded her with hot irons and shipped her to Ireland. Only Wessex adhered to the cause of Edwig, and he was at last compelled to bow before his enemies. He acknowledged his brother as king of all England north of Thames, and died almost immediately after 959. His death put the whole realm into the hands of Eadgar, or rather of Eadgar's friends of the church party, for the new king was still very young. He recalled Dunstan from exile to make him his chief counselor, and when Archbishop Oda died, he gave the See of Canterbury to him. For the 17 years of Eadgar's rule, Dunstan was his prime minister, and much of the character of the earlier years of the king's reign must be attributed to the prelate. Dunstan's policy had two sides. He used his secular powers to enforce his religious views, and everywhere he and his friends began reforming the monasteries by forcing them to adopt the Benedictine rule. They expelled the secular canons, many of whom were married men, from the cathedrals and replaced them with monks. They also dealt severely with the custom of lay persons receiving church preferment, one of the commonest abuses of the time. But Dunstan was not only an ecclesiastical reformer. His activity had another and a more practical side. To him, in conjunction with Eadgar, is to be attributed the complete unification of the Anglo-Danes and the English. Instead of being treated as subjects of doubtful loyalty, the men of the Danelagh were now made the equals of the men of Wessex, by being promoted to ealdormanries and bishoprics and admitted as members of the Witan. Eadgar kept so many of them about his person that he even provoked the thanes of Wessex to murmuring. But the policy of trust and conciliation had the best effects, and for the future the Anglo-Danes may be regarded as an integral part of the English nation. When he came to years of maturity, Eadgar proved to be a capable prince. His power was so universally acknowledged in Britain that his neighbors never dared attack him, and he became known as the Rex Pacificus, in whose time were known no wars. All the kings of the island served him with exact obedience. The story is well known how he made his 6 chief vassals, the kings of Scotland, Cumbria, Man, and 3 Welsh chiefs, row him across the Dee, and then exclaimed that those who followed might now in truth call themselves kings of Britain. Eadgar was a firm ruler, and the author of a very considerable PG-50 body of laws. To him is attributable the first organization of local police in England, by the issue of the Ordinance of the Hundred, which divided the shires into smaller districts after the Frankish model, and made the inhabitants of each hundred responsible for the putting down of theft, robbery, and violence in their own district. He allowed the Danish half of England to keep a code of laws of its own, but assimilated it, as much as he was able, to that which prevailed in the rest of the land, making Dane and Englishman as equal in all things as he could contrive. To the misfortune of his realm, Eadgar died in 975, before he had attained his 40th year, leaving behind him 2 young sons, neither of whom had yet reached his majority. When he was gone, it was soon seen how much the prosperity of England had depended on the personal ability of the house of Alfred. Under weak kings, there began once more to arise great troubles for the land.